Before we can imagine how Mance Rayder could have won, we need to understand exactly where he stood before the decisive war began. The man known as the King Beyond the Wall was no ordinary freefolk leader. He was a former member of the Night's Watch, a black-clad crow who had turned his back on the rigid vows of the Watch in favor of the wild, untamed freedom of life beyond the wall. This was not just an act of rebellion, it was a calculated choice. Mance had seen firsthand the flaws, politics, and crumbling strength of the Watch. When he abandoned his vows and joined the Free Folk, he brought with him knowledge of the Wall's defenses, the Watch's tactics, and perhaps most importantly, their weaknesses. By the time Mance began uniting the disparate clans of the Free Folk, the threat of the White Walkers was no longer just a children's tale, whispered around campfires. The dead were stirring in the far north. The others, with their icy servants, were pushing steadily toward human settlements. To Mance, the invasion south wasn't about conquest for glory, it was survival. He knew that the wall was the only meaningful barrier between the living and the dead, and he recognized something that most wildlings could not accept. They would have to flee south to escape extinction. But getting the free folk past the wall was no easy feat. At the start of his campaign, Mance had achieved something remarkable. The free folk were notoriously fractious, a dozen different clans, each with its own leaders, customs, and grudges. From the hard-bitten raiders of the frozen shore to the Thens, with their bronze weapons, from the horn-footed Ice River clans to the massive giants riding woolly mammoths, no single leader had managed to unite them in living memory. Mance did it through charisma, diplomacy, and a reputation for fairness. He treated the clans as equals rather than subjects, creating a coalition that was unprecedented in scale. This gave him a massive advantage in sheer numbers, tens of thousands of warriors, hunters, and survivalists, backed by beasts of war like giants and mammoths. However, his army was not a traditional army in the southern sense. They were not drilled soldiers, accustomed to formations or strict discipline. They were skilled fighters, but their greatest strengths lay in mobility, guerrilla warfare, and survival in harsh terrain, not siege warfare against a massive ice wall manned by defenders, entrenched in fortified positions. Mance also had to contend with a fundamental strategic constraint. He could not simply wait. The White Walkers were advancing, and the Free Folk's northernmost territories were already becoming uninhabitable. His people were not united by a love of conquest, but by desperation. Families with children, the elderly, and the wounded were among the horde. He had to move quickly to avoid starvation and encirclement. Speed was his ally, but it also meant that his army's logistics were fragile. Beyond manpower, Mance's assets included a knowledge of the wall's weak points. As a former ranger, he knew which castles were abandoned, which stretches were poorly defended, and where the terrain could be used to his advantage. Unconventional units, giants capable of hauling massive logs or dragging siege engines, mammoths that could pull down gates, agile raiders able to scale cliffs and launch surprise attacks. Morale built on necessity. His people fought with the desperation of those who knew the alternative was death or slavery to the White Walkers. But his position was also fragile. The Free Folk lacked the heavy siege equipment that southern armies used to break fortified positions. They relied on scavenged steel and bone weapons, with little armor compared to the Black Brothers on the wall. Their food supply was strained, large armies consumed massive resources, and the barren lands north of the wall offered little in the way of sustained provision. Geopolitically, Mance's timing was both a blessing and a curse. The War of the Five Kings had fractured the Seven Kingdoms, which meant that the Night's Watch could expect little reinforcement from the south. However, this same chaos meant that any victory Mance achieved would quickly attract the attention of southern lords eager to reclaim control of the wall. His goal, therefore, was not just to break through, but to do so decisively and quickly enough to establish a defensible foothold before outside forces could react. Another key aspect of Mance's position was his reason for attacking where and when he did. He chose Castle Black not only because it was the Watch's headquarters, but also because it was strategically positioned in the center of the wall. If he could take Castle Black, he could control access to both the east and west, effectively locking down the Night's Watch and creating a gateway for the Free Folk migration. He understood that splitting his forces too thin across multiple points might make them vulnerable, but a concentrated assault carried its own risks. particularly when the defenders were dug in and supported by the wall's sheer height and thickness. In terms of intelligence, Mance had another advantage. He knew that the Watch was undermanned. Decades of neglect from the southern kingdoms had left their numbers dwindling, their equipment aging, and their leadership politically fractured. This is why Mance initially believed a massive show of force, tens of thousands of warriors against a mere few hundred defenders, would be enough to compel surrender. It was a gamble that assumed the Night's Watch valued survival over honor, but that gamble underestimated the stubbornness and fatalism ingrained in the Watch's vows. As the campaign began, Mance's situation was both promising and precarious. He had the largest free folk army in history, the element of surprise in his choice of timing, and knowledge of his enemy's weaknesses. But he also carried enormous logistical challenges, an urgent timetable, and the looming shadow of the White Walker. If we are to explore how Mance Rayder could have won, we must start from this understanding. He was not a warlord seeking conquest in the traditional sense. He was a leader trying to save his people from annihilation, with the wall as both the ultimate obstacle and the ultimate salvation. In the chapters that follow, we will explore the precise strategic choices that, if altered, could have shifted the balance in his favor. But this starting point, the fragile coalition of desperate tribes, the knowledge of the Watch's weaknesses, and the race against the dead, forms the foundation for every what-if that follows. For all of Mance Rayder's strengths as a leader and unifier, his initial campaign south toward the wall suffered from several critical strategic errors. These weren't mistakes born of incompetence. Mance was an intelligent commander, but rather the product of conflicting pressures, imperfect intelligence, and the immense logistical challenges of moving the largest free folk host in living memory. To understand how he might have won, we first have to dissect the choices he made that ultimately left him vulnerable to defeat. The siege mindset versus free folk strengths. One of Mance's most significant errors was attempting a direct siege of Castle Black. A siege is a slow, grinding tactic that favors defenders, especially when they have a near impenetrable wall of solid ice 100 meters high. The free folk excelled in mobility, hit-and-run raids, and the use of terrain. They were not built for a prolonged standoff against a fortified enemy. By choosing a large-scale frontal assault and encampment near the wall, Mance sacrificed one of his army's greatest advantages: unpredictability. Had Mance relied instead on simultaneous, smaller-scale infiltration attempts across multiple stretches of the wall, targeting abandoned castles like Greyguard or the Shadow Tower, he could have forced the Watch to divide its already thin numbers. Instead, his choice of a concentrated assault turned his army into a stationary target, giving the Night's Watch and later Stannis Baratheon a fixed point to strike, misjudging the Night's Watch resolve. Mance's own history as a brother of the Watch may have worked against him here. He believed that the Watch, faced with overwhelming numbers, would be pragmatic and surrender to preserve their lives. But the vows of the Night's Watch are steeped in honor, duty, and fatalism. "I am the sword in the darkness" is more than a ceremonial phrase. To a man sworn for life, death in defense of the wall is an honorable end. Mance underestimated just how deeply these ideals ran, especially among leaders like Jair Mormont, Alliser Thorne, and Jon Snow, who were willing to die before yielding the gate. This miscalculation was fatal, because it informed Mance's initial decision to parley rather than immediately press the attack with everything he had. The delay allowed the Watch to fortify its defenses, rally what little manpower it had, and prepare countermeasure. Failure to preempt Stannis Baratheon. Perhaps the most glaring missed opportunity in Mance's campaign was his failure to anticipate or intercept Stannis Baratheon's intervention. Stannis, campaigning in the south, had been persuaded by Melisandre to aid the Night's Watch, and unlike the Watch, he brought heavy cavalry, disciplined infantry, and the resources of a southern army. Mance did not have accurate intelligence on southern movements, and as a result, Stannis' arrival hit him like a hammer from the side. Had Mance placed scouts and outriders further south, or even launched diversionary raids into the Gift, the lands just south of the wall, he might have delayed Stannis or at least forced him to reveal his approach. Even small harassment forces could have bought Mance crucial time to break through before Stannis arrived. Logistical vulnerabilities. Moving tens of thousands of people across the harsh terrain north of the wall is no small feat. While the free folk were used to the cold, Their sheer numbers meant they consumed vast amounts of food, water and firewood each day. Unlike a professional army with dedicated supply lines, Mance's host had to forage as it moved, a process that slowed their advance and made them more visible to enemy scouts. By the time they reached the wall, many of Mance's forces were likely fatigued, hungry and low on morale. This made it harder to maintain the momentum needed for a rapid breakthrough. A more strategic approach might have involved sending smaller vanguard forces ahead to secure food caches and supply points, allowing the main host to arrive in better condition for battle. Underuse of giants and mammoths. Mance possessed rare and powerful assets in his giants and mammoths. Yet in the opening engagements, these were often used in frontal charges rather than specialized roles. Giants could have been deployed to construct makeshift siege towers, pull down defensive structures, or block gates and tunnels to prevent Night's Watch sallies. Mammoths, instead of being sent directly into arrow fire, could have been shielded with barricades of wood and hide to give them greater survivability during assault. By deploying these creatures more strategically, for instance, in synchronized assaults with climbing parties, Mance might have overwhelmed the defenders before they could concentrate fire. Over-reliance on a single breakthrough point. Mance's decision to focus so much effort on Castle Black itself ignored the strategic potential of the wall's many other castles, most of which were abandoned or lightly held. By splitting his forces into multiple assault groups, each targeting a different section of the wall, Mance could have forced the Watch to make impossible choices, leaving at least one breach point vulnerable. Instead, his concentrated approach meant that the Watch could pour all its meager manpower into defending a single spot, effectively multiplying their strength through terrain and fortification. Delays caused by diplomacy. As a charismatic leader, Mance valued unity among his people, but his willingness to hold councils and negotiate with fractious clan leaders during the campaign slowed the army's movements. This was partly unavoidable. Keeping the Free Folk coalition intact was essential to avoiding desertion or infighting. But the timing was costly. Every day spent in camp gave the Watch more time to prepare and increased the risk of southern intervention. In a more decisive strategy, Mance might have delegated diplomacy to trusted lieutenants while maintaining the army's forward momentum, ensuring that political cohesion didn't come at the expense of military advantage. Lack of psychological warfare. Mance could have done more to break the morale of the Night's Watch before the main assault. Nighttime raids, horn blasts to keep the defenders awake, the display of captured brothers of the Watch along with offers of mercy to deserters. All of these could have chipped away at the defenders' resolve. Instead, the Watch's morale remained unbroken, fueled by a sense of defiance that was only reinforced by the sight of Mance's forces stalled at the wall. Conclusion. The window that closed. In hindsight, Mance's campaign faltered not because his cause was unjust or his army weak, but because his choices created a narrowing window of opportunity, one that closed the moment Stannis's banners appeared on the horizon. Each misstep compounded the others. The decision to concentrate on Castle Black gave the defenders a clear objective. The underestimation of the Watch's resolve led to delays. The lack of southern intelligence allowed a relief army to strike unopposed. If Mance had adjusted even 2 or 3 of these factors, perhaps by opening multiple points of attack, deploying his unique assets more effectively, and keeping his army in constant, unpredictable motion, the history of the wall might have ended very differently. When most people think of Mance Rayder's war, they imagine it as a clash between the wild, chaotic free folk and the disciplined, duty-bound Night's Watch, a purely northern struggle waged in the shadow of the wall. But Mance's conflict didn't exist in a vacuum. The South, fractured by the War of the Five Kings, was a landscape of political instability and opportunity. This chaos created the possibility, however remote, that Mance could have forged a southern alliance before launching his final push. And if he had secured even a single ally among the lords of Westeros, his chances of success would have increased dramatically. A world in political disarray. By the time Mance assembled his massive host, the 7 kingdoms were in turmoil. The Iron Throne was contested. The Riverlands were in flames. The North was suffering under occupation, and the Reach and Stormlands were locked in power struggles. Most importantly for Mance, the Stark stronghold of Winterfell had fallen to the Boltons, leaving the North divided and resentful. In this climate, The loyalty of northern bannermen was not guaranteed to the Boltons or to King's Landing. Some houses, like the Manderleys, secretly plotted rebellion. Others were simply waiting for a strong enough leader to rally behind. For Mance, this political fragmentation represented an opening, if he could present himself not as a barbarian invader, but as a potential liberator. Recasting the free folk image, the biggest obstacle to any southern alliance was perception. To the lords of Westeros, the free folk were savages, raiders, thieves and killers who rejected the civilized ways of the South. But Mance understood the value of narrative. He could have reframed his people not as conquerors, but as refugees fleeing an existential threat that the Southerners themselves would soon face, the White Walkers. Had he dispatched envoys, perhaps even Southern-born deserters from the Watch or captured knights willing to bargain for their lives, he might have persuaded sympathetic lords that helping the free folk was a matter of mutual survival. In return, he could have offered military support against common enemies, such as the Boltons or the Lannisters. Possible targets for alliance. Several key figures and regions stand out as plausible allies for Mance. House Manderley of White Harbor, Lord Wyman Manderley, publicly bent the knee to the Iron Throne, but privately plotted to restore Stark rule. Mance could have approached the Manderleys, with a promise of aiding in the liberation of Winterfell in exchange for safe passage through the north. The northern mountain clans, fiercely independent and skilled in guerrilla warfare. These clans had little love for southern rulers. They might have sympathized with the free folks' desire for autonomy, especially if offered spoils from Bolton-controlled lands. Disaffected Stark loyalists. Any lord still holding out for the return of the Starks might have seen Mance as a means to weaken the Bolton grip, especially if Mance framed himself as an ally of the Stark cause. The Ironborn, strategically, although culturally incompatible, the Ironborn shared the free folks' disdain for southern norms. A temporary pact of non-aggression, or even coordinated raids, could have distracted southern forces long enough for Mance to consolidate his position. Benefits of an alliance. A southern ally could have offered several decisive advantages. Intelligence. An ally with eyes and ears in the south could have warned Mance of Stannis' approach, allowing him to prepare or avoid confrontation entirely. Political legitimacy. If even one noble house publicly supported Mance's cause, it could have changed the narrative in the south from invasion to coalition, making it harder for other lords to justify immediate intervention. Safe wintering grounds. The free folks' greatest challenge was survival through the long winter. An ally could have offered temporary refuge while Mance regrouped for future campaigns. Challenges and risks. Of course, forming such an alliance was easier said than done. Trust between the free folk and the people of the Seven Kingdoms was virtually non-existent. The cultural gap was immense. The free folk valued personal freedom, and had no concept of feudal loyalty, while the South's entire society was built on hierarchy and oaths of service. There was also the issue of timing. Mance's window for diplomacy was short. The closer the others came, the more desperate his people became, and the more he had to prioritize movement over negotiation. Sending emissaries south risked losing control of his coalition, if the clans saw diplomacy as a waste of time. Finally, aligning with any southern house could have alienated other potential partners. For example, siding with Stark loyalists might have made enemies of the Boltons and their supporters, who, despite being cruel overlords, controlled the North's largest military force at the time. The path not taken. Still, history is full of examples where necessity forced enemies into alliance. If Mance had recognized the War of the Five Kings as an opportunity for strategic partnerships, he could have built a broader coalition. Imagine this alternate timeline. Tibet sends envoys to House Manderley months before the march to the wall. The Manderleys, seeing a chance to undermine the Boltons, agree to supply Mance with food, steel and scouts in exchange for a pledge to help free Winterfell once the free folk are through the wall. Mance uses this new supply chain to launch multiple assaults on the wall's abandoned castles, breaking through at several points, even with foothold established. He sends free folk warriors to assist the Manderleys in harassing Bolton forces, earning further goodwill in the south. Such a strategy wouldn't have made Mance a lord in the eyes of the south, but it could have given him the breathing room he needed to avoid immediate destruction at the hands of Stannis' fresh troops. Conclusion. An alliance of necessity. The potential for a southern alliance was always slim, but not impossible. Mance's skills as a negotiator and his deep understanding of both free folk and southern culture positioned him uniquely to bridge the gap. By leveraging the chaos of the War of the Five Kings and framing his cause as one of mutual survival, he might have turned at least one southern power to his side, and that could have been the difference between the king beyond the wall becoming a historical footnote and becoming the founder of a new, united North. Mance Rayder's greatest achievement before the war wasn't a battle or a siege. It was the political miracle of uniting the free folk. For centuries, the Wildlings had been divided into fiercely independent clans, each with its own chieftains, customs, and grudges. No single leader had commanded their loyalty for long, because the free folk despised centralized authority. To them, freedom was sacred. Bending the knee was something only Southerners did. Yet Mance changed that. Through charisma, diplomacy, and a deep understanding of both Southern and Northern cultures, he brought together raiders from the frozen shore, spearwives from the haunted forests, the disciplined Danes, the horn-footed men, the cannibal clans, and even the mighty giants. It was a feat so improbable that the Night's Watch initially underestimated just how large and united his force really was. But while his coalition was vast, it was also fragile. If Mance had been able to solidify Wildling unity before launching his southern push, the free folk's collective strength could have been exponentially more effective. Instead, internal divisions remained a latent vulnerability, a weakness that became more pronounced once the campaign began to stall. Leadership among the free folk was usually situational. A clan followed the strongest hunter, the most successful raider, or the bravest warrior, and loyalty lasted only as long as that leader delivered results. Mance's authority was based on respect, not law, and respect could fade quickly if his plans faltered. This meant that even though Mance commanded tens of thousands, he did not control them in the same way a southern king commanded bannermen. His orders were not absolute. Each clan had its own priorities, rivalries, and grudges. The Thanes, for example, were disciplined and militaristic, while the frozen shore clans valued independence above all else. Without constant political maintenance, these differences could turn into open dissent. Key figures in the coalition, several influential chieftains and war leaders stood out within Mance's alliance. His loyalty was invaluable, but even he had limits. His primary allegiance was to his own family and people. The Styre, Magnar of Then, leader of the Thanes, Styre commanded disciplined, heavily armed warriors who followed a rigid hierarchy. While loyal to Mance, Styre's personal ambitions and cultural pride could have become a problem if he felt sidelined. Rattleshirt, the Lord of Bones, a fierce warrior and skilled raider, Rattleshirt was less cooperative, known for his arrogance and self-interest. His influence among the more unruly clans made him important but also unpredictable. The Giants, not politically organized, but critical to the war effort. Their cooperation depended on respect and fair treatment, and they would not fight for a cause they considered dishonorable. The problem of cultural rivalries. Some of the Wildling factions had long histories of mutual hostility. The Thanes looked down on other free folk as lesser for not sharing their disciplined ways. The cannibal clans were feared and distrusted by everyone else. The frozen shore raiders mocked the more civilized Thanes, and so on. Mance's personal presence could paper over these divides, but in his absence, tensions could boil over. For example, during the march south, disputes over food or loot could lead to skirmishes within the camp. These weren't just petty squabbles, they undermined morale, wasted energy, and could weaken trust during critical moments of battle. What consolidation could have looked like if Mance had slowed his push toward the war to focus on deeper political consolidation. Several strategies might have strengthened his coalition. That unified war council, instead of issuing orders directly to dozens of clan leaders, Mance could have established a formal war council with representatives from each major group. This would have created a sense of shared ownership in the campaign and reduced feelings of favoritism. Clear division of roles, assigning specific military or logistical responsibilities to each clan could have given them a stake in the army's success. For example, Thanes as the disciplined vanguard, frozen shore raiders as scouts and flankers, giants as siege specialists. Shared training camps. Mixing clans in training exercises could have fostered camaraderie and mutual respect, breaking down cultural barriers before the real fighting began. Resource sharing agreements, establishing clear rules for food and loot distribution, would have minimized disputes and made the army's supply lines more efficient. Every day spent on diplomacy and consolidation was a day the White Walkers crept closer and the weather worsened. But stronger unity early on might have allowed for more coordinated assaults on the wall, reducing casualties and speeding up the campaign in the long run. Had the coalition been fully consolidated, Mance could have executed multi-pronged attacks, without fear that one faction would abandon its post or refuse orders in the heat of battle. A united free folk army could have adapted more quickly to changing conditions, whether that meant splitting forces to hit multiple wall castles, or retreating in good order to avoid Stannis' surprise arrival. The morale factor, the psychological strength of a unified army cannot be overstated. If every wildling from spearwife to giant truly believed they were part of a single cause, morale would have been far harder to break. When morale is high, armies can endure harsh conditions, repel larger forces, and recover from setbacks without collapsing. Mance's coalition fought with desperation, but desperation is a double-edged sword. In the face of prolonged resistance, desperation can turn into hopelessness, and hopelessness leads to desertion or mutiny. Consolidated leadership could have kept spirits high and ensured that no single defeat unraveled the entire campaign. The alternate timeline. Imagine a different path. Mance spends the year before the march holding massive gatherings beyond the wall, not just to rally warriors, but to forge lasting agreements between clans. Rival chieftains share meals, fight mock battles together, and establish personal bonds. A common war banner is created, not just Mance's personal sigil, but a symbol representing all the free folk. When the march south begins, each clan knows its place in the grand strategy. There's no confusion over orders, no hesitation in following them, because every leader helped create the plan. By the time they reach the wall, the free folk are not just a horde, but a disciplined, coordinated force, the closest thing to a professional army the far north has ever seen. Conclusion. The power of lasting unity. Mance Rayder proved that the free folk could be united. The tragedy is that the unity he forged was temporary, held together by his charisma and the immediate threat of the White Walker. If he had managed to consolidate that leadership into a permanent political and military structure, the wildlings might not only have broken through the wall, they could have held their ground against both the Night's Watch and Stannis Baratheon. A fully united free folk would have been more than just a mass of desperate refugees. They would have been a formidable, organized force capable of shaping the political fate of the North. And in that scenario, the history of Westeros could have been rewritten. When we think of Mance Rayder's great push toward the wall, we picture a vast army of tens of thousands advancing in the open, campfires stretching for miles, giants and mammoths trudging through snowdrifts, and war horns echoing in the cold night. It was a spectacle meant to intimidate, and in that regard, it succeeded. But while the sheer scale of Mance's host projected power, it also surrendered one of the most valuable tools in any commander's arsenal: stealth. As a former ranger of the Night's Watch, Mance knew the value of covert movement and deception. Rangers thrived on avoiding detection, striking suddenly, and disappearing before the enemy could react. These were tactics the free folk had practiced for generations in raids on the Night's Watch or on northern villages. Tactics perfectly suited to the terrain and the enemy they faced. Yet in his final campaign, Mance relied overwhelmingly on direct confrontation, allowing the Watch to focus their defenses on a single point. If Mance had integrated more stealth operations and diversions into his overall strategy, the entire complexion of the war could have changed. The element of surprise in northern warfare. The wall is a defensive marvel, 300 miles long, 700 feet high, and patrolled from a string of castles, most of which were abandoned by Mance's time. But its size was both a strength and a weakness. A thinly stretched watch couldn't possibly guard every inch effectively. Many stretches went unpatrolled for days, even weeks. Historically, the free folk had used this to their advantage. Small warbands could scale the ice using grappling hooks, climb frozen cliffs, or slip through mountain passes like the Skirling Pass that bypassed Castle Black altogether. They could vanish into forests, skirt patrols and emerge miles from where the watch expected them. Mance could have multiplied this threat by launching a coordinated wave of small infiltration teams along the wall, keeping the watch constantly guessing where the next breach might occur. Diversionary assaults, splitting the watch's focus. At the time of Mance's attack, the Night's Watch numbered only a few hundred active fighting brothers, and that included stewards and builders who were pressed into service. The defenders could barely hold one castle, let alone the entire wall. Yet by concentrating his army in front of Castle Black, Mance gave them exactly what they needed, a single focal point for their limited manpower. Diversions could have changed this completely. Imagine Mance sending a detachment of a few hundred warriors to stage an aggressive assault on Eastwatch by the Sea, complete with fires, horn blasts, and giant lead feints. Simultaneously, another detachment harasses the Shadow Tower in the west. Even if neither assault aimed to take the castle outright, the Watch would have been forced to send precious reinforcements, leaving Castle Black weakened and vulnerable to a main breakthrough. Small-scale infiltrations. One of Mance's biggest missed opportunities was the use of stealth parties to infiltrate the wall's less defended sections before the main army arrived. Even a few dozen skilled climbers could have scaled the wall at night, overpowered a small guard post, and opened a hidden tunnel or drop rope for others to follow. Such infiltrators could have cut supply lines, sabotaged winches and gates, or even set fire to key structures from within. This would have sown chaos in the Watch's ranks, and potentially allowed Mance to seize a section of the wall before the main battle even began. Blizzards could reduce visibility to a few yards, deaden sound, and disorient even seasoned rangers. Mance's forces, accustomed to moving in such conditions, could have launched stealth advances under the cover of storms, emerging suddenly from the whiteout to assault lightly defended point. Weather-based assaults would also have reduced the effectiveness of the Watch's archers, whose long-range advantage was crucial in holding off giant lead charges. Mance could have used a variety of tricks to keep the Watch off balance. They erased false camps, setting up large fires, tents, and decoy movements to make it appear as though the main host was approaching from one direction, while the real force advanced elsewhere. Warhorn manipulation, blowing horns at irregular intervals from multiple points along the wall to create the illusion of a much larger, dispersed army. They feigned retreats, drawing the Watch into sending out a sortie, then ambushing them with hidden reserve. Each of these tactics could have forced the Watch to waste energy, manpower, and resources defending against threats that were only partially real. At first glance, it might seem absurd to think of giants, massive beings several times the size of a man, as part of a stealth operation, but in the right terrain, even giants could be concealed until the moment of impact. Dense pine forests, deep ravines, or snowy gullies could have hidden their movements until they were close enough to smash through lightly defended gates or palisades. Coordinating such an attack with smaller stealth units could have maximized shock value. Defenders, reeling from a silent infiltration, suddenly finding themselves face to face with a giant would have been far more likely to break. The Night's Watch fear factor. Stealth attacks and diversions would have carried a powerful psychological effect. The Watch's morale was already strained. They were outnumbered, under-equipped, and unsure if any southern reinforcements would arrive in time. If Mance had forced them to fight on multiple fronts, unsure where the next strike would fall, paranoia and exhaustion could have set in. Fatigue is a silent killer in war. If the Watch was kept awake for days by sudden horn blasts, shadowy movements in the forests, and small-scale night raids, their ability to resist a major assault would have been greatly diminished. Why Mance chose visibility over stealth. So why didn't Mance lean more heavily into stealth? There are several likely reasons. The refugee factor. Mance's host wasn't just warriors. It included families, children, and elders. Moving such a massive group in secret was impossible, so he may have felt that a large visible escort was necessary for protection. Diplomatic signaling. By showing the full size of his army, Mance may have hoped to intimidate the Watch into surrender without a fight. Time pressure. Stealth campaigns take time, and the White Walkers were advancing. Mance may have decided he couldn't afford prolonged infiltration. Still, a hybrid approach, combining visible intimidation with covert strikes, might have given him the best of both worlds. The alternate campaign. Imagine this alternative. Months before the main march, Mance dispatches multiple small warbands to infiltrate abandoned wall castles and set up hidden supply caches, south of the wall. As his army advances, these sleeper units sabotage winches, weaken gates, and monitor Night's Watch patrols. When the main host finally arrives, the Watch has already endured weeks of psychological pressure, false horn calls, burning supply depots, sudden disappearances of patrols. Just as the defenders brace for the main assault at Castle Black, giants emerge from the forest at the Shadow Tower, and raiders set East Watch's stables aflame. In the chaos, a stealth unit inside Castle Black opens a gate from within. The Watch, unable to cover every point, is overwhelmed before Stannis ever rides north. Conclusion: the victory that could have been won in the shadows. Stealth and diversion were the free folks' natural strengths, weapons they had honed for generations in raids and skirmish. If Mance had embraced those strengths on a grand scale, he could have stretched the Night's Watch to its breaking point long before southern reinforcements could arrive. Instead of a single grinding confrontation at Castle Black, the war might have been a series of rapid, unpredictable strikes that kept the Watch permanently off balance. In war, the enemy that attacks from nowhere is often the one that wins, and in the frozen wilderness north of the wall, nowhere is everywhere. The Night's Watch of Jon Snow's era was a shadow of the legendary order it had once been. In the days of the First Men and early Stark kings, the Watch had numbered in the thousands, with well-supplied castles, regular patrols, and a strong flow of recruits from noble houses. By the time Mance Rayder stood beyond the wall, preparing to lead the greatest free-folk host in history, the Watch was reduced to a few hundred men spread thin over a massive defensive line. If ever there was a time to exploit the Watch's vulnerabilities, this was it. Mance knew their weaknesses intimately. After all, he had once worn the black himself. But while he leveraged some of that knowledge, his strategy didn't fully capitalize on the structural, logistical, and psychological flaws that could have made the wall's defense collapse even before the first giant charged the gates. The manpower crisis. Perhaps the most obvious weakness was sheer numbers. The Watch could barely man 3 castles, Castle Black, the Shadow Tower, and Eastwatch by the Sea, and the majority of its fortresses along the wall had been abandoned for generations. Many stretches of the wall went completely unguarded. This should have been a gift to an attacking force. Mance could have taken advantage of this by launching simultaneous attacks on multiple castles to split the Watch's limited manpower, occupying abandoned castles to stage assaults from behind the Watch's defensive lines. The Watch's defensive capacity was built around the assumption that the wall itself was nearly impenetrable. Mance had the opportunity to challenge that assumption with a multi-pronged offensive, but he concentrated almost all of his forces in one location, allowing the Watch to focus their defense. Alliser Thorne, Janos, Slent, and other officers harbored personal grudges and political ambitions. Jon Snow's rise as a leader was met with resentment by some, while others disagreed over how aggressively to respond to Mance's movements. These fractures could have been exploited through captured brothers of the Watch or sympathetic turncloaks. Mance could have sent false intelligence into Castle Black, exaggerated numbers, misleading attack locations, or threats of betrayal from within, to deepen mistrust between commanders. The more they doubted each other, the less coordinated their defense would have been. Logistical vulnerabilities. The Night's Watch depended heavily on supplies from the south, grain, steel, livestock, transported up the King's Road or by ship to Eastwatch. These supply lines were long, exposed, and vulnerable. If Mance had sent raiding parties deep into the Gift, the fertile lands immediately south of the wall, he could have burned stored grain intended for the Watch, accured livestock before they could be driven to the wall, destroyed ships in Eastwatch's harbor to cut off seaborne supply. A well-timed disruption of these supplies in the weeks before the main assault could have left the Watch scrambling for resources, forcing them to ration food and weakening their morale. Over-reliance on the wall's height. The wall itself was an awe-inspiring defense, but it was also a psychological crutch for the Watch. Many of the defenders had never faced a large-scale assault and believed the wall to be an unbreachable shield. Mance could have shattered that illusion by staging repeated small attacks with giants and mammoths at less defended sections. He could have shown the defenders that the wall could be damaged or scaled. Even if these attacks weren't decisive, the knowledge that the wall wasn't invincible would have gnawed at the Watch's confidence. The Castle Black weakness. Castle Black, unlike many southern fortresses, had no defensive wall on the southern side. It was designed to defend against threats from the north, not from the south. This meant that if Mance could get a significant force through the wall, even at a distant location, he could have marched on Castle Black from behind, bypassing its main defenses entirely. This made a breakthrough at an abandoned castle or a remote section of the wall even more strategically valuable. The Watch could have found themselves surrounded inside their own headquarters. Most of its members were criminals sent to the wall as punishment, with little loyalty beyond the bare minimum. A prolonged campaign of fear could have broken their will to fight. Mance could have used tactics like kicking, displaying captured brothers alive but bound, offering them back in exchange for surrender. At the Kiev, sending taunting messages, promising mercy for those who deserted, but destruction for those who stay. Blowing war horns at irregular intervals to deprive defenders of sleep and keep them on edge. Sleep deprivation, fear, and uncertainty can ruin even the most disciplined army. For the Watch, already outnumbered and poorly equipped, it could have been the tipping point, exploiting the absence of southern reinforcements. At the time of Mance's attack, the Night's Watch could not count on immediate help from the south. The War of the Five Kings had drained manpower from the north, and southern lords were focused on their own survival. Mance had a small window in which the Watch stood truly alone. If he had launched rapid, overwhelming attacks during this period, before Stannis' arrival, he might have broken through before any organized relief force could intervene. Instead, delays in consolidating his forces, negotiating, and attempting to intimidate the Watch gave Stannis exactly the time he needed to march north. The alternate offensive. In an alternate timeline, Mance sends out 3 major raiding groups. Weeks before the main host arrives, another infiltrates and occupies 1 or 2 abandoned castles, establishing hidden ladders and ramps for a sudden mass climb. The third conducts constant harassment of patrols, cutting down the Watch's ability to scout his main movement. When the main army finally arrives, the Watch is already hungry, exhausted, and unsure where to concentrate their defense. The first breach occurs at a remote point, and within days, Castle Black finds itself attacked from both north and south. Why Mance didn't press these weaknesses harder? There are understandable reasons why Mance didn't go all in on exploiting every weakness. Refugee burden. He was leading not just warriors, but civilians, who needed protection and could not be easily split into small, fast-moving groups. Risk of fragmentation. Sending too many forces away from the main host risked weakening the army's cohesion and leaving smaller bands vulnerable. Belief in negotiation. Mance genuinely hoped to avoid unnecessary bloodshed by convincing the Watch to let his people through. Pushing the Watch to desperation might have guaranteed an all-out, last-man-standing defense. Still, war rarely rewards mercy when time is short. If Mance had leaned into exploiting the Watch's most glaring vulnerabilities from the start, he might have achieved his breakthrough without facing a united southern counterattack. Conclusion. The weak links in the wall's chain, the Night's Watch, for all its noble vows, was not an unshakable military force in Mance's time. It was a worn, undermanned, and poorly supplied garrison. By pressing on their manpower shortage, cutting their supply lines, undermining their morale, and using the wall's own size against them, Mance had the opportunity to break the defense before Stannis' banners ever appeared. In war, a commander's job is to find the weak link in the enemy's chain and snap it. For the king beyond the wall, that chain had more weak links than strong ones, and in another life, he could have used them all to his advantage. When historians and singers talk about the free folk's great assault on the wall, they almost always mention the giants and mammoths first. These towering creatures were more than just muscle. They were living siege engines, unmatched in raw strength and sheer intimidation. A single giant could haul logs heavier than any human could lift, and a mammoth could smash through wooden fortifications that would have taken a southern siege crew hours to dismantle. Mance Rayder knew the symbolic and practical power of these allies, but in the actual battles before the wall, their potential wasn't fully realized. Instead of using them in coordinated, specialized roles, they were often deployed in straightforward charges, where their size made them targets for concentrated arrow fire from above. In a fight where every advantage mattered, the giants and mammoths could have been decisive, if used more strategically. The unique capabilities of giants. The giants of the north weren't just brutes swinging tree trunks. They had specific advantages that could have been leveraged. At strength for heavy siege equipment, giants could carry and operate large battering rams, roll siege towers into place, or lift ladders too heavy for human soldiers. Height advantage. A giant could throw rocks, logs, or even sharpened stakes over short walls or barricades, forcing defenders to keep their heads down. Psychological impact. The mere sight of a giant charging through snow can rattle even disciplined soldiers. For the green recruits and petty criminals of the Night's Watch, this fear factor could have been crippling. The problem was that Mance didn't use these traits to their fullest potential. Giants were often exposed to open ground, trudging toward Castle Black's gate without significant cover. Against archers firing from the safety of the wall, this was a death sentence. At the Mammoths, the free folks living war machines. If giants were the infantry's heavy lifters, mammoths were their tanks. These colossal, shaggy beasts could pull enormous loads, plow through snowdrifts, and trample through timber barricades. Properly armored or shielded, a mammoth could have smashed through the outer defenses of Castle Black in minutes. But mammoths were also vulnerable. Their sheer size made them impossible to miss, and their natural instincts meant they could panic when injured or surrounded. In the battles we know of, mammoths were sometimes driven into the fight without adequate protection, allowing concentrated volleys of arrows or flaming projectiles to bring them down before they reached their target. Potential specialized roles. If Mance had truly leaned into the unique capabilities of his giant and mammoth forces, several specialized tactics could have been game changers. Armored mammoth battering rams, outfit mammoths with thick hides, wooden plating, or even scavenged metal sheets to protect against arrows. Harness them to massive, reinforced rams that could smash through Castle Black's main gates, or the doors of any abandoned castle Mance sought to occupy. Giant siege crews. Instead of sending giants forward in the open, place them behind mobile barricades, thick wooden screens on sleds that they could push forward while under fire. Once in range, they could use massive axes or sledgehammers to weaken key sections of the wall's gates or inner supports. While the wall itself was too high for this, structures south of the wall, like guard towers or palisades, could be overrun quickly. Boulder throwers. Giants could hurl rocks at winch mechanisms, rope pulleys, and wooden guard platforms on the wall, crippling the Watch's ability to operate their defenses effectively. Coordinated timing with infantry. In the actual battle at Castle Black, the giants and mammoths often attacked as part of a general rush, with no clear synchronization with other units. A better use of them would have been to send them in after smaller infantry skirmishes had distracted or weakened the defender. For example, Step 1. Light infantry and archers launch harassment attacks from multiple angles, drawing defenders to the parapets and forcing them to spread their fire. Step 2. Giants approach behind mobile barricades, carrying rams or ladders. Step 3. Mammoths are driven forward at the exact moment the defenders are reloading or repositioning, minimizing the time they spend under heavy fire. The goal would have been to ensure that every giant and mammoth that entered the battlefield had the best possible chance of making it to their target alive. Using giants and mammoths for diversions. These creatures didn't have to be part of the main breakthrough, they could also serve as terrifying distraction. Imagine a pair of giants leading a small detachment toward Eastwatch by the sea, stomping through the snow and blasting war horns, while the real assault took place miles away at an undermanned section of the wall. Even if the diversionary force never intended to breach the defenses, the Watch would be forced to redeploy precious men to meet the perceived threat, weakening their presence where the real danger lay. Environmental advantages. The terrain beyond the wall offers plenty of opportunities to conceal large creatures, especially in dense forest or heavy snowfall. Giants could have moved through wooded areas undetected, until they were close enough to strike. Mammoths, with their thick coats, could blend into the snow at a distance, especially in the chaos of a blizzard. Coordinating an attack during a snowstorm could have made giants and mammoths exponentially more dangerous. The defenders would have less time to fire accurately, and the beasts could have closed the distance before suffering significant casualty. Protecting against the Watch's countermeasures. The Night's Watch's most effective defense against giants and mammoths was concentrated missile fire. arrows, bolts, and flaming projectiles aimed at their heads and vulnerable spots. To counter this, Mance could have equipped them with improvised armor made from boiled leather, thick hides, or stolen southern shields lashed together, positioned archers to suppress defenders while the giants and mammoths advanced. The free folk didn't have advanced siege technology, but they had the ingenuity and resourcefulness to adapt the tools at hand for maximum effect. The psychological edge. Beyond their physical capabilities, giants and mammoths had unmatched psychological value. Even the sight of a giant climbing over a barricade, or a mammoth charging through snow could send less disciplined soldiers into retreat. Mance could have amplified this effect by staging mock displays before the main battle, parading giants in full war paint, having mammoths trumpet in the night, or creating the illusion that he had more of them than he actually did. Morale plays a huge role in any siege, and in a small, under-strength garrison like the Night's Watch, breaking morale could have been as decisive as breaking the gate. An alternate scenario. In an alternate version of the battle, Mance holds his giants and mammoths back at first. While the Watch braces for their arrival, small warbands infiltrate abandoned sections of the wall and sabotage gates from within. Then, in the middle of a snowstorm, the mammoths appear armored, shielded by mobile barricades, and accompanied by giants carrying massive rams. As the Watch pours its fire on these advancing behemoths, the infiltrators open a southern approach into Castle Black. The defenders are suddenly attacked from both sides. Confusion and fear spread faster than the cold, and the battle ends before Stannis's banners ever appear on the horizon. Conclusion. Untapped potential. Giants and mammoths were the free folk's most extraordinary assets, living, breathing symbols of the untamed power of the far north. Used recklessly, they were vulnerable. Used strategically, they could have been unstoppable. By integrating them into coordinated, protected, and purpose-driven assaults, Mance Rayder could have transformed them from awe-inspiring spectacles into decisive instruments of victory. When history looks back at Mance Rayder's campaign, the moment his chances for victory truly collapsed wasn't during the fighting at Castle Black. It was when Stannis Baratheon's army appeared seemingly out of nowhere, slamming into the free folk host from the flank. That single intervention turned a tense stalemate into a rout, forcing Mance to surrender and ending his bid to lead his people south. But Stannis's march north wasn't a surprise to everyone. Word of his movements filtered through the realm weeks before his arrival. In a different timeline, Mance could have recognized Stannis as the single greatest threat to his campaign, and acted accordingly. A well-timed preemptive strike, whether through interception, disruption, or outright assassination, might have neutralized the Baratheon threat before it ever reached the wall. Understanding the Stannis factor, by the time Stannis decided to march north, his southern ambitions had faltered. The War of the Five Kings was shifting, and he was in desperate need of a cause that could win him legitimacy and loyal followers. Melisandre, his Red Priestess and chief advisor, persuaded him that aiding the Night's Watch was both a sacred duty and a strategic move. Defeating Mance and saving the realm from the Wildlings would give him political capital with the North and possibly divine favor from Mance's perspective. This made Stannis far more dangerous than any other southern lord. Unlike the Lannisters, who were busy in the south, or the Boltons, who were consolidating their hold on Winterfell, Stannis had both the motive and the mobility to intervene quickly. His army was small by southern standards but far more disciplined and heavily armed than anything Mance's warriors had ever faced. The fatal underestimation. Mance's focus was fixed almost entirely on the wall and the Night's Watch. He seemed to assume that any southern army would either arrive too late to matter or be unwilling to brave the northern cold in large numbers. This miscalculation was critical. Stannis's arrival with cavalry, infantry and heavy armor, forces perfectly suited for a decisive open-field strike, came before Mance had managed to break through. In other words, Mance's entire campaign was caught between the anvil of the wall and the hammer of a southern army. Once that happened, his defeat was inevitable. Intelligence and early warning. The first step toward a preemptive strike would have been better intelligence gathering. Mance had plenty of scouts watching the wall, but few monitoring the lands far to the south. If he had sent riders into the Gift or beyond, He might have heard reports of Stannis's movement in time to react. Such scouts could have identified choke points along his route, narrow passes, frozen rivers, or forested trails, perfect for an ambush. Disrupted supply trains or baggage lines to slow his progress. The further south Stannis was delayed, the more time Mance would have had to press his advantage against the Watch. Intercepting Stannis on the march. If Mance had learned of Stannis's march early enough, he could have deployed a mobile strike force to meet him before he reached the wall. This wouldn't have required his entire host, a few thousand fast-moving warriors, supported by giants and mammoths, could have blocked key passes or destroyed vital fords. The goal wouldn't necessarily be to destroy Stannis's army outright, but to force him into costly skirmishes in unfamiliar, frozen terrain. Deny him secure winter encampments, and stretch his supply lines until hunger and cold weakened his troops. Every week Stannis was delayed, was a week the Watch had to hold out without relief, and sabotage and harassment tactics. The Free Folk were masters of guerrilla warfare. Small warbands could harass an advancing army endlessly, ambushing scouts, stealing horses, setting fire to supply wagons, and vanishing into the snow. Against a disciplined but cold-weather inexperienced force like Stannis's, these tactics could have inflicted disproportionate damage. Other possible tactics included south trails and decoys, leading Stannis into dead ends or snowed-in valleys. In night raids, attacking camps under cover of darkness, killing sentries and stampeding horses. Frozen river traps, luring cavalry onto ice that could be collapsed or weakened beforehand. These wouldn't just harm Stannis's numbers, they'd sap his army's morale long before they ever saw the wall. Assassination or targeted strikes. In a more ruthless alternative, Mance could have aimed to remove Stannis personally. Without his leadership, his army's cohesion could have faltered, especially given the unusual alliance between his men and Melisandre's followers. Potential assassination methods. Infiltrating Stannis's camp disguised as traitors, deserters, or even captured free folk. Using stealth parties to set fire to his command tent during a night raid. Coordinating with sympathetic northern clans to strike from within. Such an act would have been risky and morally complex, but in terms of cold military logic, eliminating Stannis might have ended the southern intervention before it began. The psychological dimension. Even without engaging in full-scale battle, Mance could have undermined Stannis's campaign psychologically. If Stannis arrived to find the Watch already shattered, the Free Folk occupying Castle Black, and raiders harassing his flanks, the image of him as the realm's savior would have been ruined. Propaganda, carried by captured men released to spread the tale, could have painted Stannis not as a liberator, but as an invader threatening refugees. If enough northern lords saw him as wasting lives fighting the Free Folk instead of addressing southern threats, his campaign's political purpose might have collapsed. Alternate timeline. The Stannis trap. In this version of events, South spots Stannis's column crossing into the Gift Weeks before it nears the wall. Mance sends a mobile force of thens and frozen shore raiders to harass the march day and night. Giants fell trees across narrow passes, slowing cavalry. Mammoths drag sleds to block key routes, and fires break out in Stannis's baggage train, destroying food stores. Stannis, low on supplies and with his men frostbitten and exhausted, reaches the outskirts of the wall too late. Castle Black has already fallen, and the Free Folk are dug in behind southern-facing defenses. Facing a fortified position in winter, with morale crumbling, Stannis turns back or attempts siege warfare, a battle type that favors defenders and buys Mance months, perhaps years of control south of the wall. Why Mance didn't strike first. Several reasons explain why Mance didn't attempt a preemptive strike. And overcommitment at the wall. His focus was on breaking through as quickly as possible, and diverting forces might have slowed the main effort. Civilian burden. With thousands of non-combatants in tow, Mance couldn't easily detach large mobile units without risking the safety of the whole migration. Underestimation. Mance likely believed Stannis couldn't march north fast enough to make a difference before the Free Folk broke through. But in war, assuming the enemy can't act in time is often fatal, and in this case, it cost Mance everything. Conclusion. The battle that never happened. A preemptive strike on Stannis Baratheon might sound like a risky gamble, but in reality it may have been Mance's best chance at securing his people's survival. By intercepting, delaying, or destabilizing the southern army before it ever reached the wall, he could have kept the battle a purely northern affair, one he was far more likely to win. In war, timing is everything, and in this war, Stannis's timing was perfect, because Mance let it be. Mance Rayder was not a warlord who craved blood for its own sake. His campaign beyond the wall was not about conquest in the traditional sense. It was about survival. The White Walkers were advancing, and his people could not remain in the far north without facing extinction. In truth, the ideal outcome for Mance was never an all-out war with the Night's Watch or the Lords of Westeros. It was safe passage south for the free folk without unnecessary slaughter. But war and diplomacy are not mutually exclusive. In fact, the most effective commanders often use the threat of war to achieve their political aims. The problem for Mance was that by the time he opened talks with the Night's Watch, he was already fighting from a position of weakness. Castle Black was still holding, his forces were stalled in the snow, and Stannis Baratheon's southern army was marching north. Had Mance shaped the battlefield and the political situation so that he could negotiate from a position of strength, when the Night's Watch feared imminent destruction, or when southern lords were divided, the story could have ended very differently. The power of leverage. Leverage in negotiation comes from convincing the other side that they will lose more by refusing your terms than by accepting them. For Mance, that meant creating a scenario where the South feared the cost of open war more than the risk of letting the free folk through. His army looked like an unstoppable force with the resources to keep fighting indefinitely. If he could make those 3 points believable, Mance could have made demands not from the standpoint of a desperate refugee leader, but as a military power offering a pragmatic solution. Psychological warfare as a negotiation tool. One path to stronger leverage would have been to combine psychological warfare with selective shows of force before entering talks. For example, demonstration assaults. Instead of throwing his full strength at Castle Black right away, Mance could have launched smaller successful raids on less defended points along the wall, proving that his army could break through it with prisoner exchanges. Capturing brothers of the Watch and returning them unharmed could signal that he was capable of mercy, making negotiations appear like a humanitarian option rather than a surrender. Relentless harassment. Keeping the Watch awake for days with warhorn blasts, fires and night attacks would wear them down, making them more receptive to talks. By the time formal negotiations began, the Watch would already be primed to see Mance not as a ragtag leader of raiders, but as a commander with the capacity to dictate terms. Timing is everything. Mance's actual attempt at negotiation came after his army had stalled in front of Castle Black, with his forces exposed and vulnerable. This was the worst possible time to parley. The Watch still held the wall, and southern reinforcements were on their way. A better timeline would have been Diversion, when a decisive small victory first, breakthrough at an abandoned castle or lightly defended section of the wall. Establish a fortified position on the southern side. Dig in and display staying power. Show the Watch and the South that his people were not going to vanish into the snow, but could hold ground through the winter. Negotiate from a strong position. With his people already inside the wall and his army entrenched, Mance could offer to stop further incursions in exchange for safe settlement. In this scenario, the Watch would be the one racing against time, fearing both further losses and the political consequences of losing control of the wall. Making the free folks' case, Mance also had a political narrative he could have used more aggressively. The free folk were not an invading army in the traditional sense. They were a population fleeing an existential threat that would eventually threaten the South as well. If Mance could have spread this message through captured rangers released with warnings, or through northern intermediaries, he might have swayed some lords into supporting a negotiated settlement. The message could have been simple but devastatingly effective. We come not to conquer your lands, but to escape the dead. Let us through and we will help you fight them. Deny us and you will face them alone. Offering incentives. In addition to threats, Mance could have offered concrete incentives to sweeten the deal. Military support against the Walkers. The free folk were experienced in fighting supernatural threats. Their warriors, giants, and mammoths could be invaluable allies in the battles to come. Mance's settlement in the gift. Instead of demanding free reign across the north, Mance could have agreed to settle his people in the sparsely populated lands immediately south of the wall, under agreed terms. Hostages for good faith. Offering hostages from among his trusted lieutenants could have built enough trust to make a limited migration acceptable to the wall. By blending fear with cooperation, Mance could have transformed the negotiation from "let us through or we fight" into "we can either be your allies or your problem, you choose." Pressuring the North politically. The fractured political state of the North after the fall of Winterfell gave Mance opportunities to pressure the region indirectly. By making overtures to disaffected, Stark loyalists, or even Bolton rivals, he could have created political headaches for the Southern-aligned leadership. If Northern lords feared that refusing Mance would lead to war on two fronts against both the Free Folk and their own neighbors, they might have pressured the Watch to settle. The alternate negotiation scenario. In an alternate timeline, Mance's army breaches the wall at a remote, lightly defended section, securing a foothold on the southern side. His raiding parties disable the Shadow Tower's gates and capture key supply points in the gift. The Watch, unable to dislodge him and fearing a southern-facing siege of Castle Black, agrees to talks. Mance offers to halt further southward movement in exchange for settlement rights in the gift, and a military alliance against the White Walker. The deal is struck, and instead of being crushed between the wall and Stannis, Mance consolidates his power south of the wall, ready to defend against the dead. Mance and Mythological. Why this didn't happen? The simplest reason is that Mance still hoped to avoid spilling blood unnecessarily. He believed his overwhelming numbers might persuade the Watch to grant passage, without the need for prolonged maneuvering. But by banking on intimidation alone, he failed to establish the conditions that would make negotiation favorable to him. Once the Watch realized that southern reinforcements were imminent, they had no reason to make concessions, and Mance had lost his leverage. Conclusion: the negotiator who waited too long. Mance Rayder had the charisma, intelligence, and strategic insight to negotiate from a position of power, but he waited until that power had already begun to erode. Negotiations work best when the other side fears losing more by refusing than by agreeing. Had Mance seized a quick, visible victory, entrenched his forces, and combined threats with genuine offers of cooperation, he might have opened the wall not with a ram, but with a handshake. Winning a battle is one thing. Keeping what you've won is another. Even if Mance Rayder had broken through the wall, whether by force, stealth, or diplomacy, his real challenge would have only just begun. The Free Folk were not a small raiding party. They were a people tens of thousands strong, with families, children, and elders among them. They needed land, food, shelter, and stability. Without a plan for long-term survival south of the wall, any victory would have been short-lived. The North, fractured though it was, would not tolerate an unchecked Free Folk presence indefinitely. So the question becomes, if Mance had succeeded in getting his people past the wall, how could he have ensured that they not only survived the winter, but also kept a permanent foothold in Westeros? Step 1. Choosing the right territory. The first and most urgent issue after victory would have been where to settle. Simply pouring the Free Folk into the northern countryside would have been a recipe for chaos and instant conflict with local lords. Mance would have needed to select a territory that offered both defensibility and resources. The most obvious choice was the New Gift and the Old Gift, the fertile but sparsely populated lands immediately south of the wall, traditionally held by the Night's Watch. These lands were underpopulated, isolated from most major power centers, and capable of producing enough food to sustain a large population if worked effectively. By claiming the gift, Mance could have established a buffer zone between his people and the rest of the North, used abandoned or underused farmland to start immediate cultivation, repaired or fortified old Watch settlements for defensive purposes. Step 2. Fortifying against retaliation. Breaking through the wall would not mean the end of southern opposition. Eventually, northern lords, whether led by the Boltons, Starks, or others, would see the Free Folk as a threat. To survive, Mance's people would need fortifications that could withstand a professional siege. Key defensive measures might include repairing abandoned castles. Many old Night's Watch castles in the gift could be quickly reinforced and turned into strongholds. Building earthworks and palisades, simple but effective defenses to slow cavalry charges and funnel attackers into kill zone. Utilizing the wall in reverse, with control of the wall, Mance could defend against any attempt by southern forces to approach from the north, while using its height for surveillance of the surrounding countryside. If the free folk could present themselves as too costly to dislodge, even hostile lords might opt for uneasy coexistence. The free folk were hunters and raiders, but large-scale agriculture was less familiar to many of them. In the gift, farming would be essential, especially with winter approaching. Possible strategies: integrating southern farmers, offering protection and trade to local farmers in exchange for food production, organizing communal farming, assigning clans to work specific plots of land, pooling resources for the greater good, hunting and fishing, using the vast northern forests and rivers to supplement the diet until crops could be harvested. Failure to secure enough food would force the free folk into constant raiding, which would only unite the north against them. Step 4: Political strategy. Military strength alone wouldn't secure the free folk's future. Mance would have needed to navigate the politics of the Seven Kingdoms carefully. His position would be delicate to aggressive, and he'd provoke a united retaliation. Too passive and he'd be perceived as weak. Key political moves could include forming alliances with northern houses, especially those disillusioned with southern rule. House Manderley, the mountain clans or other Stark loyalists could become valuable partners. Offering military aid against common enemies, the White Walkers, Ironborn Raiders, or even the Boltons could all serve as shared threats to unite the free folk and certain northern factions. Negotiating recognition. A formal agreement with a recognized power, such as a Stark claimant or even the Iron Throne, under the right circumstances, could legitimize the free folk's presence. Step 5: Managing internal unity. Mance's coalition beyond the wall was fragile even before victory. Once in the south, old rivalries between clans could easily flare up, especially over land distribution, food, or leadership. If unity fractured, the free folk could collapse into infighting, making them easy prey for external enemies. To maintain stability, Mance could have established a council of clans, giving each major faction a voice in governance to prevent feelings of marginalization. Setting clear rules, agreements on land division, resource sharing, and dispute resolution to minimize blood feuds. Keeping the army mobilized, even in peacetime, maintaining a strong fighting force to deter rebellion or invasion. Step 6: Preparing for the dead. Mance's original motivation was to flee the White Walkers. Breaking through the wall wouldn't erase that threat. It would only buy time. In the long term, his people would need to prepare for the same enemy they had been running from. Preparation could include training with southern weapons, crossbows, steel-tipped arrows, and southern-style armor. Fortifying against whites, fire-based defenses, secure storage of flammable materials, and elevated watchposts. Alliances for the long war. Even bitter enemies might join forces when the dead march. Mance could use this inevitability as leverage in his political dealings. An alternate victory and survival timeline. Imagine this scenario. Mance breaches the wall at an abandoned castle. Bypassing Castle Black entirely, his forces sweep into the new gift, capturing old watch holdings and fortifying them. Within weeks, scouts establish outer defenses, while clans are assigned farmland in both the new and old gift. Mance sends envoys to House Manderley and certain mountain clans, offering military aid against the Boltons in exchange for recognition of free folk settlement. As winter deepens, the free folk remain united, their food stores bolstered by trade and farming. By the time southern forces muster, they face a well-defended, politically entrenched, free folk nation that cannot be easily removed. Why this would have been hard, but not impossible. Securing a long-term free folk presence south of the wall would have been one of the hardest nation-building projects in Westerosi history. The cultural gulf between the free folk and the southern kingdoms was massive, and the north's harsh environment would punish any mismanagement. But with careful planning, political savvy, and the discipline to maintain unity, Mance could have transformed his people from perpetual outsiders into a recognized power. Conclusion: from survival to legacy. If Mance Rayder had broken through the wall and then focused not just on surviving the winter, but on building a lasting settlement, the free folk's story could have been rewritten entirely. Instead of being remembered as a desperate horde crushed by southern steel, they might have been known as the founders of a new northern nation, one forged in the cold, defended by giants, and united under the king beyond the wall. Victory is fleeting without a plan for what comes after. For Mance, winning beyond the wall was never just about the battle. It was about ensuring that his people could live free, not just for one season, but for generations to come.